Vladimir Putin has long had a desire to be taken seriously on the world stage, and for the last few years that desire has mostly looked like a very expensive mistake. Size sanctions, frozen assets, European countries cutting off Russian gas, China is squeezing him on price. The whole thing was supposed to slowly strangle the Russian war machine until it couldn't afford to keep fighting in Ukraine. That was the plan. A slow, grinding economic squeeze. And it was actually kind of working, a surprise, until 3 weeks ago. Because something happened in the Middle East that nobody in Washington really wants to talk about. And what happened is this. The United States and Israel hit Iran hard. And the moment those strikes landed, oil prices shot through the roof. We're talking $119 a barrel. And the one person on planet Earth who benefits the most when oil goes above $100, that would be the guy sitting in the Kremlin gloating like he just hit a jackpot in a casino he wasn't even supposed to be allowed into. Russia pocketed an estimated $7.7 billion from fossil fuel exports in just 15 days. 15 days. That's not a typo. I'll explain exactly how that number breaks down in just a minute. But first, I want you to sit with that for a second, because the whole point of Western sanctions for the last 3 years has been to cap Russian oil revenue, to starve the war, to make Ukraine affordable to defend by making Ukraine unaffordable to attack. And in 15 days, that entire strategy basically got blown up, not by Putin, not by some clever Russian countermove, but by a strike that the US and Israel launched on Iran. Now, is that a coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the word coincidence is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Because when you start pulling the threads on this story, things get a little uncomfortable. And I think you already know what I mean because you clicked on this video. So let's get into it. Let's start with the basics, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we get into the more interesting stuff. Russia exports a massive amount of oil and gas. Even after all the sanctions, even after Europe tried to wean itself off Russian energy, Russia still sells enormous quantities of fossil fuels. It just shifted who it sells to. Instead of Germany and France and the Netherlands, it now sells to India, China, and Turkey. And it does this using what's called a shadow fleet, which is basically a bunch of old tankers that operate under obscure flags, Gabon, Panama, Cameroon, and don't show up cleanly on Western tracking systems. This shadow fleet has been running Russian oil for 2 years. The U.S. Treasury has sanctioned a lot of these ships. There are lists, there are designations. There's a whole bureaucratic apparatus designed to stop Russian oil from reaching the global market through the back door. Now here's where it gets interesting. When U.S. and Israeli forces hit Iran, oil markets panicked. Supply disruption fears sent Brent crude up past $119 a barrel. That is a significant price spike. Every extra dollar per barrel is extra money for Russia. And at $119 a barrel, Russia's revenue per exported barrel goes up enormously compared to where it was when oil was sitting at $78 in January. According to data pulled from European energy tracking agencies and cross-referenced with shipping intelligence firms, Russia's fossil fuel export revenue jumped approximately 14% in the 15 days following the strikes on Iran. That 14% surge adds up to roughly $7.7 billion in extra earnings above what Russia was projected to make, 7.7 billion euros, in 15 days. Now let me put that in context. Ukraine's entire defense budget for 2024 was about $43 billion. And that required enormous contributions from NATO countries to sustain. Russia just earned the equivalent of roughly 1/5 of Ukraine's annual defense budget as a bonus in 15 days, from a war it didn't fight, in a country it technically isn't at war with, and it gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. Here is the part that really made me do a double take when I first read it. And I want you to pay attention here because this is the part that the mainstream coverage sort of glossed over. The Trump administration issued a waiver, a 30-day sanctions waiver, for shadow fleet tankers. Specifically, the waiver allowed tankers that had previously been sanctioned, ships on the Treasury's own list, to continue unloading cargo at ports during a transition period. Now, the official explanation is that this was a logistical necessity, that sanctioning ships mid-voyage creates chaos at ports, that the waiver was purely technical and boring, and you should definitely not read anything into it. And maybe that's true. I'll get to why I don't totally buy that in just a minute. But let's just note, for the record, that in the same 15-day window that Russia earned an extra $7.7 billion from the oil price spike caused by the Iran strikes, the Trump administration also granted a temporary waiver that allowed Russian shadow fleet tankers to keep operating without disruption. Both of those things happened at the same time. I'm not saying they're connected, I'm just saying they happened at the same time. And now let's talk about Putin himself, because his public reaction to all of this has been extraordinary in its confidence. In the days following the Iran strikes and the resulting oil price spike, Putin gave a series of statements about Russian energy policy. And the tone of those statements was not the tone of a man under economic pressure. It was the tone of a man who just watched his portfolio go up 14% and wants everyone to know he noticed. He talked about Russia's ability to redirect energy supplies to Asia. He described Russian oil and gas as having multiple potential buyers. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here because the original was in Russian, that Russia could conditionally consider helping Europe with energy supplies if Europe adjusted its political posture. Conditionally. He used the word conditionally. That is not the language of a man whose economy is being strangled by sanctions. That is the language of a man who just realized he has leverage again. And the reason he has leverage again is because oil went to $119 and stayed there. And so the question I want to ask, the question I think is actually worth asking, is whether this windfall changes anything about the Ukraine war. And I think the honest answer is yes, probably a lot. Before we go further, I want to take just a quick moment to talk about today's sponsor. If you've been following this channel for any length of time, you know that one of my recurring themes is that when geopolitical chaos hits, normal people are usually the last to protect themselves. Politicians, oligarchs, billionaires, they have advisors and structures and contingency plans. Regular people have a savings account and hope. That's why I want to mention Birch Gold Group, who have been helping Americans protect their savings with physical precious metals for over 20 years. When oil spikes, when currencies wobble, when sanctions get waived and $7.7 billion changes hands in 15 days, gold tends to do what it does. You can text Paul to 989898 to get a free information kit with no obligation. It takes about 30 seconds, and it might be the most useful 30 seconds you spend this week. Okay, back to Putin's jackpot. So let me now do something I enjoy, which is take the official explanation apart piece by piece. Because the official explanation here is actually several official explanations layered on top of each other, and I want to show you why each layer has a problem. Official explanation number 1. The U.S. struck Iran because of nuclear program concerns and regional security threats. The oil price spike was an unintended consequence. Okay, let's accept that at face value. The problem is that the U.S. has enormous analytical resources. The CIA, DIA, RAND Corporation consultants, Treasury economists, all of these people model what happens to oil markets when major Middle Eastern producers face military strikes. This is not a mystery. It's not an unknown unknown. Everybody in Washington who thinks about energy markets for a living knows that striking Iran sends oil above $100. That's not a side effect. That's basically a guaranteed outcome, and it has been for 20 years of wargaming. So, when the administration says, we didn't know oil would spike, that strains credulity somewhat. Official explanation number 2. The 30-day sanctions waiver for shadow fleet tankers was a routine logistical measure with no geopolitical significance. The problem here is the timing. You don't issue sanctions waivers the same week you're trying to pressure Russia over Ukraine and simultaneously dealing with an Iran crisis unless there is a reason that overrides the optics. What possible reason could there be to ease pressure on Russian oil shipping at the exact moment Russian oil revenue is spiking from $78 to $119 a barrel? The two moves together, the Iran strike and the waiver, create an enormous windfall for Moscow. If that was accidental, it is possibly the most expensive accident in the history of Western foreign policy. Official explanation number 3. Russia's revenue gains are temporary and will be offset by market normalization as the Iran situation stabilizes. Maybe, but oil has memory. Markets that spike to $190 don't snap back to $78 in a week. They drift. they settle at a new equilibrium. And even if oil eventually comes back down, Russia has already banked $7.7 billion in 15 days. That money is real. It's already in the system. You can't unbank it. Official explanation number 4. The Trump administration is applying maximum pressure on Iran, and Russia's gains are just collateral noise. This is the most interesting one to me. Because if the goal is maximum pressure on Iran, you'd think you'd also want to maintain maximum pressure on Russia, since Russia and Iran are allied. They share drone technology. They share sanctions evasion infrastructure. Iran sells Russia Shahed drones that get used against Ukrainian cities. If you're squeezing Iran, it makes strategic sense to also squeeze Russia at the same time so they can't prop each other up. Instead, what happened is the opposite. Iran got squeezed. Russia got a windfall. The two countries most aligned against Western interests came out of the same 15-day window, with one being bombed and the other being enriched. That's a strange outcome if the goal was coherent pressure on the anti-Western alliance. Let me pull this back to a bigger pattern for a second, because I think the Iran situation doesn't exist in isolation. It rhymes with something we've seen before. Think about what happened in 2022 when Russia first invaded Ukraine. The immediate sanctions packages were supposed to collapse the ruble and starve Russia within months. That was the projection. The ruble actually recovered within weeks, partly because Russia pivoted its energy sales to Asia so quickly that the financial pressure never fully materialized. The pattern is Western governments announce pressure. The pressure has official channels, and then there are unofficial channels. Shadow fleets, waivers, price exceptions, Indian and Turkish intermediaries, through which Russian revenue quietly keeps flowing. And every time a new crisis creates an oil price spike, Russia's cushion gets bigger. This is the boiling frog problem. Each individual waiver is small. Each individual exception is justifiable. Each individual spike is temporary. But the cumulative effect is that 3 years into a major war, Russia's war economy is still functioning. Putin is still talking about conditionally helping Europe. And Ukraine is still dependent on Western aid that is becoming increasingly politically contested. The frog didn't notice it was boiling, and maybe we're the frog. Now here's where I want to give you several theories for what's actually going on, because I genuinely think there are multiple plausible explanations, and I want to be honest about the uncertainty here. Some of this is analysis, some of this is speculation, and I'll tell you which is which. Theory 1, pure incompetence. The simplest explanation is that Western governments are just not very good at coordinating complex multi-front pressure campaigns. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. The Iran strike team isn't talking to the Russia sanctions team. The Treasury waiver was issued by someone who didn't model the interaction with oil prices. Everything is a mess, nobody is in charge, and Russia got lucky. This theory has a lot going for it, frankly, because governments are frequently incompetent in exactly this way. Theory 2, deliberate de-escalation bait for Russia. This one is a bit more sophisticated. The idea is that by allowing Russia to bank a windfall, you're actually giving Putin a reason to not escalate militarily. If Russia is making money, it has less incentive to do something desperate, like hitting a NATO country or using a tactical nuclear weapon. You keep the temperature down by letting Putin feel successful economically while bleeding him militarily in Ukraine. The waiver and the oil spike are intentional, not accidental. This is the keep the wolf fat so it doesn't bite approach. It has historical precedence and it's not crazy. Theory 3, Trump's Gulf allies needed the oil spike. This one is more cynical. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, have been navigating a complicated relationship with both the US and Russia. High oil prices benefit them enormously. A strike on Iran, which is their regional rival, also benefits them geopolitically. And Trump has very close relationships with Gulf sovereign wealth funds and Gulf leadership. Is it possible that the Iran strike served multiple purposes, including driving oil to $119 in a way that benefits Trump's Gulf allies? I'm not saying yes. I'm saying it's a theory worth sitting with. Theory 4. Russia and the US have a back-channel understanding on Ukraine. This is the most speculative theory and the one I'll caveat most heavily. But it goes like this. There are negotiations happening about Ukraine that are not public. In those negotiations, the U.S. needs Russia to not escalate while a ceasefire framework is being discussed. To keep Russia at the table, the U.S. quietly eases economic pressure. Through the waiver, through not aggressively enforcing oil price caps, Russia banks its windfall, and in exchange, Russia agrees to stay at the table. The Iran strike was a separate track, but the waiver timing was not accidental. It was a quiet signal. I want to be clear, I have no proof of this, but it explains the timing better than pure incompetence does. Theory 5. This is exactly what it looks like, and nobody cares. The oil companies make money. Russia makes money. The Gulf states make money. Politicians in multiple countries get to look strong. The people who suffer are Ukrainian civilians, Iranian civilians, and European consumers paying higher energy bills. And the people making decisions about waivers and strikes don't experience any of those consequences directly. So the system just keeps producing outcomes that benefit powerful actors while the costs land on people who have no say. This is less a conspiracy theory and more just a description of how power works, which is maybe the most uncomfortable theory of all. Now, my personal number one theory. And I'll tell you up front that this is my reading of the situation. You're allowed to disagree. In fact, I'd be slightly worried about you if you always agreed with me. I think what we're watching is the slow unraveling of any serious Western commitment to using economic pressure to end the Ukraine war. And the Iran situation is accelerating that unraveling. Here's why I think that. The Ukraine war has been grinding for over 3 years now. Western publics are fatigued. Political coalitions that supported Ukraine are fracturing in Europe, in the United States. At the same time, Russia's war economy has proven more resilient than expected. And now, with oil at $119 and Russia banking $7.7 billion in 15 days, Moscow is being handed a lifeline precisely when the West should theoretically be tightening the noose. What that tells me is that there is no serious plan to end this war through economic pressure. There never really was a coherent endgame that said, by month X, oil revenue will drop to level Y, Russia will face internal unrest, and Putin will have to negotiate. Instead, there were a series of pressure measures that were always porous, always had exceptions, and were always being undermined by the competing interests of different players. And the Iran windfall is the clearest illustration of that porousness we've seen yet. A war in another country, a 15-day window, $7.7 billion, and nobody in Washington is holding a press conference to explain how this happened and what they're doing to prevent it from happening again. That silence is significant. When governments are proud of something, they talk. When they're embarrassed by something, they use technical language about waivers and logistics. And when they have no good answer, they say nothing and hope you move on. I'm not moving on, and I don't think you should either. Because here's the connection to the bigger picture. Putin's Ukraine offensive isn't running on ideology. It's running on money. It's running on the ability to pay soldiers, buy ammunition, import components through third countries, and sustain a grinding war of attrition that Russia believes it can outlast. Every $7.7 billion windfall extends that calculation. It means another few months of grinding, more Ukrainian cities, more frontline deaths, more displacement. The Iran war jackpot didn't just enrich Putin, it potentially extended the war in Ukraine by a measurable amount. And the countries that launched the strikes that triggered the jackpot are the same countries that claim to be Ukraine's most important allies. I'm not saying that's intentional, I'm saying it's the outcome. And at some point, outcomes are more important than intentions. So where does that leave us? It leaves us watching a situation where the official story, Western solidarity, pressure on Russia, support for Ukraine, and the actual economic reality, Russia banking billions, shadow fleets getting waivers, oil at 119, are moving in completely different directions. It leaves us with a Russian president who 3 years into an illegal war that was supposed to leave him isolated and economically ruined, is talking about conditionally helping Europe from a position of leverage with a fresh $7.7 billion in the account. And it leaves us with a question that I started this video with and want to end with. Is this a coincidence? Is it incompetence? Is it a conspiracy? Or is it something more mundane and more depressing? Which is that the people making these decisions are optimizing for their own interests, and Ukraine is somewhere further down the list. I honestly don't know the full answer, but I know that the official explanation has at least 4 significant logical holes in it. And I know that when an official explanation has that many holes, the truth is usually somewhere the official narrative isn't pointing. Vladimir Putin wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted leverage. He wanted to be the guy that Europe had to come back to. And right now, sitting on a $7.7 billion oil windfall from a war he didn't even fight, watching a 30-day sanctions waiver protect his shadow fleet, and talking about helping Europe conditionally, he's getting exactly what he wanted. And the most unsettling part of this whole story isn't the money, it's that we helped him get it. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, the single most valuable thing you can do is subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. We're going to be covering how the Iran situation develops, what it means for Russian energy revenues over the next quarter, and whether the ceasefire talks on Ukraine can survive a Putin who just got a lot wealthier than he was 2 weeks ago. Share this video with one person who you think needs to hear this, not to alarm anyone, just because informed people make better decisions. And like the video if you found it valuable. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people and keeps us doing this work. I'll see you in the next one.